Hi. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to cover poorly designed protocols. Now, there's quite a few protocols that have been designed in the early days that didn't have security in mind. We're going to be covering FTP, one that's widely used today, especially with web developers. And the problem that I have with FTP is that the usernames and the passwords are being transmitted in clear text. Now, a lot of people don't think it's a big deal because no one can really see what's in the wire, but it is a big deal, and I'm going to show you how people can see what's in the wire. So there are other protocols that are often used. We've got POP, and there's HTTP, regular HTML websites that are going over HTTP, are all plain text. Email and Telnet. So there are quite a few different protocols that are being used. Now the good thing is most protocols that are coming out replacing the protocols are built with security in mind. So it is getting better, but there is still quite a bit of misuse and poorly designed protocols out there. So the other thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to actually be setting up an FTP server. So we're going to get comfortable with using like Server 2003 to set up a website and an FTP site. So I'm going to start by just powering on my Server 2003. So I'm going to open the console and then power the machine on. And I'm going to log into this with a Control-Alt-Insert. And we do not have a password for the 2003, so I'm just going to press Enter. And it always starts with the splash screen. Okay, so when you install a program, normally you go online and you download the exe and you install it. There are certain programs that come along with Windows. So we're going to install one of those programs, and that's going to be FTP, and along with that comes IIS. So I'm going to go to Control Panel, and then Add and Remove Programs. So most people come here when they want to uninstall a program that was previously installed. Currently we don't have anything installed. So I'm going to go to Add and Remove Windows Components. So this is a different area. And I want to use this as an application server, so I'm clicking on the word. I didn't click that checkbox, I'm just clicking on application server, and then I'm going to go into the details. Now in here we have Internet Information Services, which is IIS. Typically when people think of IIS, they think of a web server. The web server is probably the most common thing that IIS is used for. In Windows, we use Internet Information Services. Typically in Linux, you're going to use something like Apache. So those are two different competing web servers. Now you can install Apache on Windows, but later in the semester I'll talk about why I don't think that's a good idea. So for right now, I'm going to go inside the IIS grouping. I didn't check that checkbox. I'm just going to go to Details. And in here we've got the File Transfer Protocol Service. So I'm going to check that. So that's going to install FTP. So that way we can transmit files from one machine to another machine. So specifically this would be something like a web developer would build a web page, and that web developer would either be working at their company or on their own computer, and at some point they want to update the website. Now this Server 2003 is going to be acting as a web server, so they're going to update that website. So I'm just going to scroll down here, and I'm going to also check on World Wide Web Service, which is the www. So I checked on both of those. I'm going to say OK. I'm going to say OK again. I'm going to go next. And I'm just going to let it install. It's prompting me for a disk. So in order to install, you may be prompted, you may not be prompted. So it's not for sure if you'll be prompted or not. If you are prompted, you'll just go into the CD. I needed to press the Control and the Alt to break free. And then I clicked on the CD. And I'm going to connect to an ISO image on a data store. And I happen to be in the Server 2003 folder. If for some reason you were on a different folder, like in the tools, we were in there previously, you'd just hit the up arrow and then you would go to the Server 2003. If you're at the root, you go to the TISO image, and then from here you should see an ethical hacking folder. And then from the ethical hacking folder you'll see the Windows Server 2003. So I'm just going to click on that ISO. And I didn't even have to click OK, it just found it. So I'm just going to close this down. And it's continuing to install. So at this point we're installing FTP and the www service. So at this point I'm just going to say finish. And I can close this down. So the way that I normally manage all of the tools like the World Wide Web or the FTP, I click on my Start button, I find my computer, then I right click on it, and then I go to the Manage. So from Manage, that gives me the ability to manage quite a few different interfaces. So I'm just going to, what I did is I clicked on the Start button, I right clicked on my computer, and then I went to Manage. So the computer management console opens up, and I've got services and applications. I'm just going to expand this node. And in here I see a node called IIS, or Internet Information Services Manager. I'm going to expand that. And I've got an FTP site. And I also have a website. So I've got my default website, and I have the default FTP site. So to start with, what I want to do is I want to create a user. I want a user that can log in. So let's just pretend we've got a web developer that's going to be updating our website for us. So since I am the site administrator, I'm going to create a user for that web developer. So underneath local users and groups, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new user. Alright, so I'm going to just click on that user folder, and anywhere in this white area I'm just going to right click and do new user. You could do it from the file menu as well, under action, new user. So I'm just going to create this user, and I'm going to call him web dev. And I'm going to give webdev a password of Tor. So TOOR is basically root spelled backwards. I don't know. It's a bad password, but it's one that we'll remember for this lab. So webdev Tor. I didn't use spaces here. I'm not going to let the user change the password because he'll just change it and forget it. So I'm going to make it so that way they cannot change it and the password never expires. Now, I'm doing that because they're actually going to be connecting to our web server through the FTP client. So they really won't even have the ability to do that type of action. So webdev Tor is my password. I'm going to write it down so I remember it. I check these two checkboxes and I click the create button. So now I'm just going to click the close button. So I've got a new user called web dev. In groups, there's an administrator group, and he's not in there. I don't want him in there. All right, so this is just a web developer, and I want that web developer to transmit files from his computer to our web server. I really don't want that user to remote desktop and install stuff or anything. So right now it's a limited user. So what I want to do now is I want to configure my FTP site, and I want to make my FTP site use this web directory. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click on this FTP site, and I'm going to go to properties. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through and set up some of the defaults. Now this first tab is good. You know, I mean, I could make this a little bit more specific, especially if I had like multiple domains being hosted on one server. For us right now, we're not doing that. We're just going to use our IP address. Because we're using the IP address, it's going to hit the default website. So I don't need to worry too much. But we could actually have multiple instances of different FTPs. We could change the ports, but we're going to keep all of this default. One thing that I do want to mention on this tab is logging is enabled. That's a good idea, especially with FTP. If somebody's brute forcing trying to log in over and over again, all those attempts will be logged. So it gives us something to look at. I know a lot of administrators turn logging off as soon as they install because they don't want the disk to get full. I like having logging enabled. Okay, so security accounts. We're allowing anonymous connections. I don't want to allow anybody to connect to the server except for the web dev user. That's it. So back in the early days, anonymous people could log into FTP servers and download stuff. I'm just going to uncheck this, and I'm going to say yes, I am sure. I do not want to have anybody log on. Okay, the only person is going to be our web dev. So the next tab is messages. If I wanted to leave a banner message or some kind of a greeting as soon as they logged in, it would scroll past their screen saying, hey, welcome to our server. I'm not going to do any of that. So the home directory. Right now, we've got a directory called c:/inetpub ftp root. Well, instead of using the FTP root, quite a few years ago, FTP was a very, very common way of transmitting files, and people would upload files, and if people needed to get certain applications, they would log into an FTP server and download files. That's not what we want to use this FTP server for. My goal for this FTP server is just to allow a developer to upload HTML files to the server. So I'm going to change this folder. I'm going to go to the browse. And by default, FTP root is for FTP, www root is for a website. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to allow our FTP to access the www. So I'm just going to go to www and say OK. So now it's the www root, and I'm going to check the write button because I want that web developer to write files to this folder. And that's also why I disabled anonymous. I do not want anonymous people to write to the folder. I only want users that have permission to. There's also a directory security. Basically, if somebody's really spamming you or hitting you hard, if one IP address keeps on attempting and attempting, you can actually block that IP address. So for right now, I'm just going to click on OK. And at this point, our FTP server is pretty much configured. The one thing that I do want to do is I want to configure the folder. So I need to go to the www root folder. So I'm going to just close this management console down, and I'm going to click on the start button and go to my computer, and I'm going to go to the C drive, and I see my inetpub, I see the FTP root, and I see the www root. So right here, I'm going to right click on that www root, and I'm going to go to properties. So remember, we created that web dev. That user is a limited user, so that user doesn't have access to a lot. if I go to security, basically right here, these are the people that have access to this folder. Our web dev user does not. They can log in, but then they'd get an error right away because they wouldn't even be able to view the contents of this folder. So I'm going to click on this add button, and I'm just going to type in web dev. Now notice how I spelled it. It's all lowercase. When I created the user, I created it with a W that was capital and a D that's capital. What I do is I always click on check name, and then it'll find it and fully qualify it. So I'm just going to say OK. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this user modify rights. So I'm going to click on that modify button. And then I'm going to say OK. So the user now has the ability to modify. I'm going to apply that, and then I'm going to say OK. So at this point, I really think we're pretty much done with this FTP site. Currently, there's a couple files in this www root folder. I'm just going to delete those out. So right now our website is empty and done, and that's fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close that folder down, and I'm going to click on my start button, and I'm going to go to my command prompt. If you don't see your command prompt, you can go to run and type in cmd, and that'll bring up your command prompt. So what I want to do is I want to get the IP address of my server 2003. So I'm just going to type in ipconfig. That's one word, ipconfig. I'm going to hit enter. So my IP address is 10.7.66.35. So at this point, I'm going to say that I'm done with setting up my FTP server. I'm actually going to stop this video, and I'll come back, and then in the next video we'll connect to the server.